Morning, everybody. Halfway to break. We're almost there. So this morning, as Paul said, I'll be presenting on the species diversity fish community objective. First of all, I want to acknowledge the rest of the members of the group who pulled all this information together. It was a lot of different data sets from all the different agencies. And so I especially want to thank Arunas for pulling together all the figures and the charts for the Canadian waters that I'll be showing up here on behalf of the group. So thank you to all the members of the group for all their contributions. So the Species Diversity FCO is to recognize and protect the array of other indigenous fish species because they contribute to the richness of the fish community. These fish, cyprinids, rare ciscos, suckers, burbot, gar, and sculpins are important because of their ecological significance, intrinsic value, and social, cultural, and economic benefits. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on, are these other fish families. And we determined that there were two indicators that we wanted to look at. First being the total number of species detected across the lake as a whole, and then the second, the population trends of each of these families that were specifically identified in the fish community objective. I'm not going to go into much detail. I just want to represent the data sets that were utilized to pull all this information together in these figures. The first is the Ontario water surveys with the broad scale monitoring and the end of spring trap netting, which has been presented multiple times already. So the next is the Fish and Wildlife Service AIS early detection and monitoring, which comprehensively samples the nearshore adult and juvenile fish community of Lake Huron and Michigan waters. The Michigan DNR gill netting and trawling survey specifically for Saginaw Bay. And then the St. Mary's River Fish Community Index netting survey, which is done every few years up in St. Mary's River in collaboration amongst all the partners that are up there. And so then we wanted to break down which regions of the lake we wanted to specifically look at as they relate to these two indicators that the group developed. The first would be lake-wide U.S. waters. The second would be specifically looking at Saginaw Bay. The third would be the joint waters of the St. Mary's River. Then jumping over to the Canadian waters, we were looking at Georgian Bay, Canadian waters of the Main Basin, and then the North Channel. And so our first indicator was to look at the total number of species detected in each of these subregions throughout the lake. So as you can see up here on the left, we have lake-wide U.S. waters, in the middle Saginaw Bay, and on the right we have St. Mary's River. Overall, it looks pretty static and pretty stable. I want to throw the caveat in that the lake-wide U.S. waters, we utilize the Fish and Wildlife Service nearshore data. And although it might look like there's an increase in the number of species that are detected, that is true, but that's because of the sampling design. It's not necessarily indicative of the number of species that are present in the lake. So we do believe that there's been no new establishment of invasive species in the lake since 2013, and no new significant extirpations of native species. So overall, amongst the U.S. waters and Saginaw Bay, St. Mary's River, we believe that the total number of species that are present in the lake are pretty stable. Same thing with Canadian waters. There's a little bit of variability from year to year, but looking at the broad scale monitoring work, it's relatively stable. Again, no new establishment of invasive species or extirpation of native species. And then same thing with the early spring trap netting, pretty static, pretty stable. So now jumping into the second indicator. And I apologize if you have trouble seeing some of these graphs up here. Ultimately, it might not matter, as you'll see. Sometimes the number of species that are captured, if I blew the figure up to the entire size of the slide up here, you still probably wouldn't be able to see them on the chart. So, and I also want to let you know to just don't look at the trend that I have below each one. This is from we actually have to update this. We're going to reconvene on the back end of this meeting as a group and determine, now that the data has been updated with all of the information, what the actual trend is going to be. So just avoid what's written at the bottom of the slide. So looking at cyprinids in U.S. waters, you can see that it's a little bit variable from year to year, But I want to mention that in 2018, this spike in cyprinids that we captured in U.S. waters is potentially just due to a few sampling events that came across large schools of shiners, which might be throwing off kind of what the overall trend is looking like. But ultimately, we don't really see any increase or decrease of cyprinids in U.S. waters. Same thing for the Saginaw Bay. We have some high years, some low years, but ultimately we're not seeing any major increases or decreases in cyprinids. And then the St. Mary's River, the same thing. It's skewed a little bit by a couple of sampling events that capture large schools of shiners, but ultimately we're not seeing any major increases or decreases in cyprinids in the St. Mary's River. Looking over at, on the left-hand side, we have Georgian Bay. In the middle, we have the North Channel. And on the right, we have the main basin. Same thing here. The species or the population trends look to be pretty static and stable across the years. We do have a little bit of variability, which could potentially be due to, again, just a few sampling events that are skewing the data. We do have to do a little bit more digging into what that might actually mean, but ultimately we're not seeing any significant increases or decreases in the data. It's a little bit variable, potentially pretty stable. And then this is the early spring trap netting data. You can see over the course of time, on the left-hand side, this is 1997. And over on the right-hand side, this is more recent years. So over the course of time, there has been a decrease in cyprinids in Georgian Bay. But as far as the most recent reporting period, 2013 to 2017, and then 2018 to 2022, it looks pretty similar to the previous reporting period. Same thing over here on the right. Not really seeing any significant trends of increases or decreases in cyprinids in the North Channel. So the second family that we were going to look at was rare ciscos. For fear of repeating data and repeating metrics that were already being described in the Corrigonan FCO, we thought it would be most appropriate to just hyperlink to that Corrigonan FCO. We wouldn't really, from the data sets that we have available, be able to come up with anything new that the Corrigonan FCO was not already coming up with. The next family is the suckers and the catastomids. So you can see here our catch per unit effort. We did have some high catch per unit effort years in the nearshore waters in 2017 and 2018, but outside of that, it's remained relatively stable with a catch per unit effort of about 2 suckers per every unit effort in U.S. waters. In Saginaw Bay, same thing. It hovers right around 1 sucker per unit effort from the previous reporting period and the current reporting period. No significant trends. And then I'll say the same thing over here in the St. Mary's River. Although we did have a significant spike in 2017, this current reporting period, 2018 to 2022, there's been no really significant trends of increases or decreases of catastomids in the St. Mary's River. Looking over at Georgian Bay, the North Channel, and the main basin, I want to point out that the green are all the other fish species that were captured outside of catastomids. So what we're really going to be looking at is the bottom of each of these charts with the yellow, and those are the catastomids and the suckers. And so you can see that it's been pretty stable in Georgian Bay, potentially some slight increases in recent years in the North Channel, and the same thing over in the main basin. Relatively stable, again, potentially some increases in recent years in the catastomids in those 2 locations. And then looking at the early spring trap netting, again, it's hard to make out on this chart, but the yellow at the bottom of each of these figures, it looks pretty stable over the course of time, although the total number of species detected or captured in these surveys has decreased over time. The catastomids have remained relatively stable. And then over here in the North Channel, we're seeing greater catch per unit effort than we are in Georgian Bay, but again, relatively stable for the years that they were captured. The next family that we're going to look at are the burbot or the lotidae. There was insufficient data to determine what that population trend was in U.S. waters and in Saginaw Bay with the current data sets that we had. However, in St. Mary's River, we're seeing potentially stable. It might look like there are some decreases in the number of detections of burbot, but if you look at the y-axis, it's on such a fine scale that it seems to be hovering around 0.1, 0.2 burbot per unit effort. So depending on how you look at it, it could be pretty stable, potentially decreasing, but I don't know if there's enough information there to say one way or another. Moving over to Georgian Bay, the North Channel, and the main basin. Again, I want to point to the bottom of this graph, which it's hard to make out, but there is a little green blip there, and it's remained pretty stable over the course of time on all three of these charts. There's really no significant increases or decreases in the number of burbot that are captured in these three subregions. Looking at the early spring trap netting, same thing. It's really hard to make out any green there. For burbot, it could just be because the burbot might not recruit well to the gear that's being utilized. But overall, just utilizing the data that we have available, we're not seeing any significant increases or decreases in the burbot in these subregions. The next family that we're going to cover are the gar. We have relatively low catch per unit effort in the U.S. waters lake-wide. We might be having some potential increases in the number of gar that we're detecting. But again, if you look at the y-axis, it's on such a fine scale that there might not be enough information there to make any conclusive result or statement in regards to an increase. So we call that increasing potentially stable. In Saginaw Bay, same thing. We're on such a fine y-axis scale. It might look like there are some potential increases in the number of gar that are being detected. But again, it's hovering right around that 0.2 to 0.4 fish per unit effort that we're detecting with these data sets. And then the St. Mary's River, it's remained pretty stable over the time series for the Fisheries Community Index netting surveys. It's hovered right around 0.1 fish per unit effort. Looking at Georgian Bay, North Channel, and Main Basin, again, the bottom of this graph, the blue there are the gar, the long-nosed gar that are being detected, and over the course of time, it's remained relatively stable. We're not seeing any big spikes or major decreases in all three of these charts. And then the early spring trap netting, it's a little bit more variable, but again, we're not seeing any major increases, decreases in the gar populations to make any conclusive determinations. And then the final family that we're going to be covering are the sculpin. And you can see here that it's been a little bit variable year to year, but overall it's hovered right around that 0.1 to 0.4 fish per unit effort. And the number of native to non-native fish has remained relatively stable. A little bit of annual variation, but nothing significant enough to draw conclusions from as far as an increasing or decreasing population. There was not enough information from the Saginaw Bay data set with the data that we had available to draw any conclusions there. And then in the St. Mary's River, outside of 2015, we had a significant spike in the number of sculpin that were detected. It's remained relatively stable, right about 0.2 to 0.5 fish caught per unit effort. And then as far as the Canadian waters, we don't have any, the data that was available to us, we didn't have enough information to make any meaningful statements about the sculpin in Canadian waters, but I think there might be an opportunity to dig into the data a little bit more and potentially see what we can find. And with that, again, I want to acknowledge all the folks on the Species Diversity Committee who helped pull all this information together. It was a lot of different data sets, and it was a lot of massaging of the data to make it align with each other. So with that, thank you to the group, and I'll take any questions.
Hey,